So I'm not at a cemetery today. I'm actually recording this intro for the video. The video is a presentation that I gave in June of 2026 at my historical society, and it was over an item that I found in our collections archive. And the presentation goes through what the item was, and then I follow the provenance and ownership and tell the family story connected to the item. So I want to make this intro to let you know I do have presentations like this that I plan to share here. I'm not sure what I will call these types of videos. Presentation is what it is, but that's not very sexy for a playlist on YouTube, so I'll have to come up with something. But this is a presentation on an autograph album, Civil War era, and the family is the Leet family. So if you're familiar with Civil War era history at all, the name may be familiar to you because George Keller Leet Sr. Was the assistant adjutant general to Ulysses S. Grant, who was a general at the time. So this book is connected to that family and that time period. So I'm sharing that story here, and I hope you enjoy it. If you like these kinds of videos and would like me to share more historical retrospectives, I'm not sure what we're calling that, on items, just leave me a comment, and thanks for watching. Thanks for coming to the presentation on this autograph album. So first of all, I want to talk about autograph albums. And so long before we carried our smartphones and Facebook, the way that we connected with our friends began with books of friends. Actually, it started, I believe, with the Dutch in the 16th century. And it was a way, so Book of Friends translated in Latin, album amicorum. Instead of carrying their phones, they carried these books around, and it was a way for them to collect signatures, to document poems or writings, or just talk about where they've been. I think of it like a commonplace book, if you know what those are these days. And whenever someone would go to a new town, they could show this book and let people know, hey, I studied with this person, I met this person, we talked about these kinds of things. So I was thinking of it like, nowadays we'd say, I went to Harvard, I studied with so-and-so, here's my diploma. So they carried these books around. So by the 18th and 19th century, in Victorian era, they kind of changed some, and they became closer to what I think of as kind of a scrapbook, a memory book. But they were still collecting signatures, a lot of their friends. This one here looks like it was from a schoolmate. Again, I got this off Wikipedia in the public domain. And as communication started shifting, people were able to maybe get letters to and from a little quicker. The idea of these albums shifted, and not so much from I traveled here, I met here, but maybe a little more of a celebrity. They still kept maybe their poems, notes from friends, but slowly but surely, we saw a shift to more people carrying these autograph books. And this is Joseph Miklicek. So here he is. He had this very big autograph album that he carried with him, and his goal was to travel the world and gather signatures. So he gathered over 50,000 signatures in this book. Yeah, pretty incredible, huh? But that was like his hobby. I'm gonna go find people, whether they're famous or not, just people I meet along the way. And kind of where we are now in the digital era, so like I talked about, we use our cell phones to connect with and show who our friends are and give them likes and maybe leave a post on their Facebook page or Instagram, whatever that social media of choice is. But we still do things like collect autographs from famous people. So I have the basketball up there in honor of the NBA Finals a band. I think this is Guns N' Roses. But so the concept of collecting autographs has sort of continued to be with us. They just shifted how we collect. In our museum, you can find albums if you're interested, or if in your research you come across mention of an album that we might have. We have the Archives Index, and that's where you would look alphabetically, and it's it's on the first page, I think, page 4 of our book. Nope, yeah, page 4, and it has 6 subtopics listed, and next to those it'll tell you the page number where you can go and learn more in our archives catalog. And so this archives catalog let me know that this album was in the Civil War box on shelf 1A, row 1. And I guess let me back up to that. In the catalog book, where it will list now specifically the item and maybe the contents in that item more generally, it will also tell you where in the collections to find it. So it'll be listed by row, shelf, and the position on that row. So if any of you have ever seen the collections or want to, you go back to your row, it'll tell you what shelf it's on, and then the position will tell you kind of how many groupings down that is. They also have numbers and can help you narrow in a little more. So this specific album was donated by Irene Josephine Haynes Leet. She was born here, my understanding is, not here, but El Dorado. She's connected to the Haynes and the Ellett family. And she made this donation. So our Past Perfect was updated in 92, so the accession number says 92, but originally it said 78. And since her husband died in 79, without doing a little more research on that, I think it was originally first donated to our museum in 78, and then when the accession numbers were updated in 92, it got a new number. And what she had told, I put 92 there because that's the most recent number I have. When she donated it, she let the museum know that it had been in her husband's family. So her husband was John Dascom Leet, and again, born in 1906, died in 1979, and they're both buried at Bella Vista Mausoleum here in El Dorado. The next thing I want to do, now that we've identified autograph albums and how the specific one came to the museum, pretty easy. Opened it right up and just past the end page, the first kind of entry on the top left-hand corner, it says John B. Leet. So it took me a minute. I was like, this isn't John Dascom Leet. This is another John, likely who he could have been named after. And it's written in pencil, so very faintly here, but when you look at the book, you can see it. It says Washington, D.C. And right over here, it says April 1865. Just got a little mark there. Not a specific day. I'll come back to my theory, so not fact, just what I think, on this date and this signature. Let me get a little further. I wanted to find the connection between John Dascom Leet and John B. Leet. I went searching at Ancestry, as one good reporter and genealogist does, and I noticed that John Dascom Leet's father is George Keller Leet Jr., and his grandfather was George Keller Leet Sr. Didn't see a John there, so I just kept on looking. But George Keller Leet Sr. had a brother named John Brown Leet. He was born in 1842 and died in 1874, so that put him alive during that time period. I felt pretty comfortable I was on the right track. So it took quite a bit of digging to find out more about John Brown Leet. There didn't seem to be any family stories in Ancestry. When I kind of went down the rabbit hole, I went to newspapers.com.
I have since included that. I made a Leet family tree, and I've noticed we've started having some connections. People are probably interested to find him. Also, the Leet family name was spelled L-E-E-T-E a couple generations back. And so current family is kind of like, not sure, was it Leet with an E or without an E? But as you saw from his handwriting, he spelled it without the last E, and subsequent family have. And in records that I found, it was spelled L-E-E-T. But again, I checked both spellings. So next I went to newspapers.com, and I found 2 clues. John Brown Leet enlisted in the Chicago Board of Trade batteries. I've read that it was U.S. artillery. And he served in the Civil War, or the Great Rebellion. But a little further down, it said his bright prospects for future usefulness as a citizen have been cut short by an untoward accident. So I thought, I just started looking for John Brown, and he's dead. As what usually happens for a lot of us looking for people up the family tree. But this one article was filled with a lot of good information and a lead for me to keep going. And in fact, I only found 4 mentions of him at all in the newspapers.com. And they're all speaking of his death. They do talk about his service in here in defense of the Union, and a little bit more about how the unit formed. It was out of Illinois. So I said, let me go finding his military records. So Illinois keeps that as public record on the website. So I found a little bit more. John Brown Leet enlisted as a private in the Chicago Board of Trade U.S. Artillery Unit. So confirm our newspaper article. He served in the Civil War. And it talks about where he mustered. And I got 2 dates, July 31st and August 1st. That's not very clear, but trust me on this. If you'd like to see this, we can print that out. So a lot of times when you look in the Civil War records, it'll show you kind of like maybe when they arrived to the place that they were mustering in, and sometimes it was the next day or a couple days later. So it shows that he mustered in July 31st, August 1st, 1862 in Chicago, Illinois. And he mustered out on August 1st, 1865 in Washington, D.C. So I felt pretty good about the connection of the dates. John Brown Leet seemed to have been in Washington, D.C., at least in August when he mustered out, likely before then for some time. If he was there and mustered out, he might have been stationed there for a while. Haven't found any information on his movements or his unit. But again, working theory. What I also noted when I came here, the list of people with the last name Leet in the Chicago or the Illinois military in a slightly different unit was George K. Leet, Brother George. So I thought I'm on the right track here. Likely they both enlisted about the same time. I think he went in August 6th, and he went in as a private. But by 1863, he was mustered out due to a promotion, so he re-entered, joined in another unit as an officer. Haven't found that one yet. Going to be pretty easy to find because he was promoted to captain and the assistant adjutant general to General U.S. Grant. Wow. So there's actually quite a bit of information on George Keller Leet. So senior, there's also a lot on George Keller Leet Jr., but this is about John Brown. And since they're brothers and they were at similar places at similar times, I felt like this was a good way to find out more about John Brown Leet. Eventually, George Keller Leet rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel before finally discharging in 1866. So a year after John Brown Leet. I went looking for a little more details on the death of Mr. John Brown. Pretty sad to find out that He died of an accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound. And according to the newspaper articles and investigation, there was one held, he was going to bed, because he was alive for a couple days. He was able to tell people what happened. If he wasn't living with George and George's wife, at that time they lived really close together, and maybe for whatever reason he might have been staying with them, because when the gunshot went off, Mrs. Keller ran into the room and he was able to say, I accidentally shot myself. He was getting ready for bed, took his pistol out, went to check and make sure it wasn't loaded before he went it under the pillow, as was his custom, so he says, and he shot himself. His family, and according to investigations with George, he had no intention of killing himself. He had a great life. He wasn't attempting suicide, but there was still an investigation that went in. They talked to George Leet. As of this article, they were not yet able to talk to Mrs. George Leet owing to an illness. I'm thinking she was pretty upset and was unable to give her testimony at that time. So this was December 16th, that he accidentally shot himself November 25th. So he lived a couple days, and I believe it doesn't actually say in here, but I think he actually died on the 13th of December. So he was kind of in and out of it, as one of the articles says here, at intervals when in his right mind since the shooting, which occurred on the night of the 25th, ultimo, so November, the deceased told family and friends that he shot himself accidentally while fooling with the pistol. So the investigation did conclude, they decided he did accidentally shoot himself, and he subsequently, his body was sent to Philadelphia. He was buried in the Allegheny, Pennsylvania cemetery. So we can not find specific information about John Brown at Find a Grave. What I found is John E. Leet, so I'm thinking it was a headstone. I want to go or have someone take a picture for me. I'm interrupting your programming to let you know that I did reach out to someone on Find a Grave and ask them to go take a photo of the headstones for John E. Leet and George K. Leet. And I gave them my suspicions that they are John Brown Leet and George Keller Leet Sr. And I gave them the information that I had, and just asked them to take pictures for me and let me know. And the same person picked up both requests and took the pictures and sent a plot map back with John Brown Leet's location to show that he was buried next to Old Judy, but he does not have a headstone. And then he took a picture of George K. Leet's plot, and it does not have a headstone either. But on the Find a Grave memorials for both men, their information has been updated. And on George K. Leet Sr.'s page, it also links to his Arlington Cemetery Memorial Find a Grave site. So they have been found. Poor dear Mr. Leet has deceased. And what we see here at the end was he was 31 years old, unmarried. It says native of Illinois, but when you look at his Illinois military record, it actually shows that he was born in Pennsylvania, as does George Keller Leet's thing. So I think they were just making an assumption because he enlisted and served with the Illinois unit. So this is the end of John Brown Leet. I haven't found any more information about him, no family stories in Ancestry. So I kind of am like, okay, where do I go from here? George Keller Leet and John Brown Leet were brothers, and they appeared to be kind of at the same places at the same time, especially when the 1864, 65, 66, they were in Washington, D.C. So we know more about George because, like I said, he was the Assistant Adjutant General to General U.S. Grant. So there's a lot of mention of him when articles appeared in the paper from Grant or about Grant. They were submitted by George Keller Leet, Sr. So George Keller Leet's son, George Jr., was 2 years old. He was born in 1872. He was 2 years old when Uncle John Brown died. And since they lived very close in proximity based on addresses in newspapers.com, but he seemed to be at the home of the Kellers the night he was shot. I'm looking at, again, this is a theory, but likely that they were pretty close. Like I said, joined the military at the same time, appeared to be in Washington, D.C. at the same time. So, again, like I said, John, unmarried and presumably childless, it said nothing about children, upon his death. I'm making the assumption that brother George K. Leet Sr. gained possession of John's property, which would include this album, and would then give us a reasonable assumption that that is how it was passed down from George Keller Leet Sr. to George Keller Leet Jr. to John Dascom Leet, who I think was the namesake of John Brown Leet. But what's interesting is the historical significance of this album, and maybe why it was donated here for keeping after or around the time of John Dascom's death by his wife. Opposite the first page, so I was taking a picture of this page here, the first page, but opposite this, what you can see a little bit is Washington, D.C., part of that signature, John B. Leet's signature that he looks like dated 1865. And the first entry is A. Lincoln. And I'm thinking, you know, maybe it could be, for sure. Because the next names on this page are William H. Seward, George Nicolay, John Hay, and it has a rank. Nicolay was a private secretary to Abraham Lincoln. Seward was also a secretary and eventually Secretary of State, do I have that right? To both Lincoln and Johnson, Lincoln's successor. And then down here, it's dated with the address. It says Executive Mansion, which is what the White House was known as at this time, and stated June 1, 1864. So we do know from history that these gentlemen were in this vicinity and with each other at this time. But you know, it raised a question. I'm like, well, John dated his signature in the book April 1865, which would have been almost a year, not quite, after this, but significantly, we know what happened in 1865. Lincoln was shot. And speculation, my theory, is that this book in 1865 or 4 was being carried by John B. Leet, gathering signatures. So he, we know, was in Washington, D.C., likely at that time, since that's where he mustered out the following year. And he was a private, I think still at this time, in the military, but he was around, you know, the president and his close advisors at this time. So it would make sense in my mind that maybe he would think, I want to get these autographs. And when Lincoln died is when I think he probably signed it and put his name in it. I think it was likely that he hadn't put his own name in it prior to that time. I'm going to let you know why I think that. Because these aren't the only historically significant names in this book. But if you open the book and you see the first name, you might think that's it in the story. This is a Civil War era book, you know, the who's who. When I was in high school, I got nominated to be in the who's who of high school seniors in the United States that year. And I think they still do stuff like that. But this album seemed to be that. And it seems to be that because of the names we find in there. But somewhere middle, somewhere in the book, what we do see is George K. Leet, Major and Assistant Adjutant General. So I'm a little more convinced that it is indeed John Brown Leet's book, since it looks like he signed it and dated it. And he collected names of the people that he was traveling with, in circles with, around, and he had those connections because of his brother, who was the Assistant Adjutant General to Grant. So my belief is, and I did speak to a couple of people who have a little bit more knowledge on this, one who's a presidential scholar on all things presidents, and Civil War era, Ken Spurgeon, and our former curator, Suzanne, because they happen to know a little bit more about this. So the first working theory was they thought maybe it had been George Keller's Sr. because it was donated by his grandson's wife. I'm under the belief that because he signed it here and not at the front, that it was not his book, but it was his brother John's. But in here, in this book, we can see U.S. Grant, and he dated it City Point, Virginia, July 6th, 1865. So again, like I said, George Keller was his Assistant Adjutant General. They were traveling in circles. I actually found a photo, which I didn't include in there, of Grant and some of his staff at his headquarters in City, Virginia. And we see George Keller Leet. All of a sudden now, this book has the signatures of maybe the current sitting president, it looked like, Lincoln, and by July, a general in the Civil War who would later become the 18th president of the United States. So we have a lot of names in this book. If this book could talk, like John Brown Leet was having people sign his book just like Joseph Miklicek anytime he came across people, but it looked like he wasn't just gathering any signatures. He was gathering the names of the leaders, the top military brass who were in DC here, kind of near the end and the end of the Civil War. The dates in the book, well, I'll get to that to the next page, but the dates in the book go from the first one we see, 1864, the last one, I think 1866, I might have seen 167, not coming to me at the moment. But some other names that we see in here. Phil Sheridan, another famous general. This is Edwin Stanton, and he dated it October 18th, 1866. Right over here, we have the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. William Tecumseh Sherman, right here. And Louis Palouse, I'm not sure how to say this name. He was the Assistant Adjutant General. He was in the War Department, and he let us know that. October 15th, 1866. So some of these pages, as was the beginning with the first page with Lincoln, it looks like these were men who were in the same room at that moment when John Brown said, hey, got my book, will you sign it? Right? Because we see that on several different pages. We also see some where there's just maybe like Edwin Stanton's or Andrew Johnson's. They took a whole page for themselves. They thought they were pretty important. Or else maybe he just came upon them, not with a group of people. I don't know. Again, these are just a sampling of some of the more significant historical figures in there. There's a lot. I'm still researching them. Some of them maybe are a little harder to read and it's taken a while. So this gentleman right here, maybe S.H. Brood or Blood, or I don't know, I haven't found him yet. So I have been using the names, the times to cross-reference, see who could be traveling with who was where, try to get a better understanding of some of these names. But I started out talking about this book and really connected with the story because it's about the people. And yes, there's a lot of significant stories in here. But to me, the first is, how did it end up in our museum? Why? Why did Irene Josephine Haynes Leet decide to donate it here near the time of her husband's death? Maybe he asked her to. Again, these are questions that I have. I'm just kind of speculating. If she did indeed donate it in 78, which was my working theory. But if she donated it in 92, she passed away in 1999, likely that they did understand the historical significance of the book. Why they didn't give it to one of their kids, I don't know. They weren't living here. They had a daughter and a son living in other parts of the country. I don't know that we'll know that. Maybe she just didn't know the full story, but knew that Grandpa George was in here, and we all do. His story and his connection to Grant is very well known. So, and the first signature makes it seem like that. But once you kind of dig in and start looking at all the pages, and you really start to see that it's a much bigger story. It's not here today. I have pictures because it has been put in the safe, and it is very delicate. You can maybe see down here, had my glove on one hand, but because the paper is so delicate, there's some argument about whether or not you should touch pages with gloves on, because you might not be able to actually feel how much tension you're putting on it, whether the paper's going to tear or not. So I used my business card and very gently lifted each page and used my gloved hand to kind of hold it back as I went looking for photos. This one was so interesting to me. There was another one that says, very respectfully yours. There was a couple of sentiments. But this one, whose name I haven't deciphered yet, didn't leave a rank. Some people didn't. Or title. I haven't figured out who he is yet. But his sentiment I was able to decipher. And it says, "May you a wife, sir, marry." Was he a bit of a rascallion? I don't know. He had a wish for him. Hope you get married someday. This was 64 to 66, 67. This is closer to the back of the pages that have been signed. There's a lot still unsigned. So to me, it looks like, unlike Joseph Meklicek, he didn't continue collecting names as he continued his travels. He lived another roughly 10 years till 1874. I think he understood the significance of the time he was in and wanted to have that snapshot. He couldn't have pictures on his cell phone in his pocket. So I think after he left DC, he did live there a little bit while later with George. I haven't found the time that they moved back, but I think that when he did, he quit kind of collecting these names because he was no longer kind of circulating in them. But it's a story of the people. A lot of them in there have been documented, but John Brown Leet, was very little known. And because someone here did know him well enough to wish that he was married or would someday find a nice lady and settle down, we know he didn't. And as a result, back to my earlier hypothesis, that after he died, George Keller Leet Sr. kept those personal items of his brothers, I think, makes the most logical sense, but it's still an assumption, on how this autograph album made its way from John Brown Leet to who I believe was his namesake, John Dascom Leet. They a lot of times use their middle names named after a mother's family last name or someone. And again, that's just a theory because, like I said, John's father was 2 when maybe his beloved uncle died, and thus his rationale, I don't know. That's just my guess. But how I think then that album has made its way here to an oil museum, Butler County History, when it doesn't really have a lot of connection to our community per se, except for the family it came down through. I'm still researching because it's so fabulous. There's so many questions that I still have. And I don't have all the answers, but if you have questions, I will entertain them. I guess I want to start with, I actually went looking for something completely unrelated for this topic. And I knew it was kind of like a needle in a haystack, that it might not even what I was looking for have ever been donated or existed. And I didn't have an item. I had looking for a connection to some citizens who were military service members in the Mexican War, maybe overlaps Civil War. Like, I was just looking, never found them or anything kind of connected with them here. Doesn't mean it's not, but maybe it isn't. But that's how I came upon the album. I was looking through, I started with the Butler County Pioneers. There's a book, and it's mostly filled with, I think, Douglas signatures. A lot of, they wanted to, in the early days, document our early pioneers. I've noticed a lot of stories. Our pioneers felt pretty proud of the fact that they've been here longer than some other folks. So they were collecting that information and then also collecting the direct descendants of those pioneers if they were gone. Usually the children, maybe the grandchild might be considered close enough to be in that group. But I went through that, didn't find the gentleman I was looking for. I'm like, ooh, another autograph album. Maybe this has more pioneers, but no.
Wow.
That's how I came across this. Yes, ma'am. Sure, and just like several of us are genealogists, you know, I'm not just limited to finding my own family. Like I said, I saw John's name right away, and I thought, who? Why?
Yeah.
What? Where? You know, just all the questions, and just to see his story come to life. And like I said, there wasn't a whole lot known. John and George both have markers in the Allegheny Cemetery. The only, John is E. Leet. I think it could have been, you know, it could be very faded from 1874. I don't know. Like I said, I want to go and get the photos. What we do know is that George K. Leet, he died young too. He was only 44 when he died in 1881. And his wife petitioned for a pension from the military, so there's some of those records that I came across. Also the declaration that George was a native of the United States. And the marker, there is a marker for him, I believe that is in Arlington, that there's connected to, especially in Find a Grave, a lot more about his history. The marker in Pennsylvania doesn't mention anything in the Find a Grave, and it's likely, you know, we know this sometimes, people kind of get lost unless there's someone there to keep kind of passing the story down. But I think because his wife lobbied for the pension for herself from him after he died to help with the, you know, raising of the kids and all that, she really pushed either for his body to be moved or at least a memorial of some kind. And that's where people are directed to learn more. But George Keller Leet happened to be, I think it was in Michigan when he died. He then went on to be a businessman, powerful connections, ended up being a trial about a scheme maybe with President Grant, General Grant, maybe to have a monopoly on some goods. Haven't gotten way down that rabbit hole. But again, like I said, there's a lot more known about George Keller Leet Sr. When he died, his family still saw Pennsylvania home, and there was reference about his interment. Again, read so much, so many rabbit holes, got to go down a little more, but have a tree on the Leet family, built making those connections. And
did you say that there's not very much on his finding, John B. on his finding?
John B.
On his finding grave?
Yeah, there's no John B.
None at all.
No, there's a John E.
Yeah.
in the Allegheny Cemetery, and there's a George K.
Have you thought about creating a memorial page for him and adding?
I did. I sent notes attached to both of them, and I said, I believe that this is John B. rather than John E. and give them, the information and his connection, because also neither one of them are connected to anyone. So I did submit that, and just kind of waiting to hear back. But again, there's not even a photo of the headstone there, which is why I'm like, if we get a photo, maybe it says John B. because
Road trip.
yeah.
Road trip.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be up in not Philadelphia, but Boston. Like, do I want to take a side trip in September? First, I'm just trying to get someone maybe who might be there to go out and take a photo. But again, I haven't got that far because I was preparing for this presentation.
Is it closer to Philadelphia or Pittsburgh?
I feel like it was Pittsburgh. It's called the Allegheny. It's the Allegheny. Pittsburgh. Says right there, Pittsburgh. When we go to the Allegheny Cemetery and then we type in Leet, John E. And 1874, kind of my thoughts. Again, it's just a guess. Won't know for sure, but again, no photo, no connected information. So I did submit, those things, and haven't heard back yet. I did that about a week or so ago.
Was his death date from the newspapers 1874?
1874, yes, from multiple newspapers. It was in the New York Herald because they actually lived in New York at the time, and somewhere, there was a little bitty one, so the articles the three kind of articles talked about the shooting, only the one talked about his military service, and then the little bitty, like one line, a list of obituaries of people who died, and talked about his remains being moved. And so everything I found is that he was not buried in New York, but here where I think some other family members and George ended up. So I think whether George was moved later or just a monument was erected to him at another place, it does feel plausible to me that both the brothers are buried here for whether there was land purchased. I know at the time Mrs. Leet did not have that pension. She applied for it because she needed funds, because she did have young children still at home when George died. So it's plausible to me still that it was, just that basic headstone, not a memorial that came later.
I really loved learning about this book. And like I said in the presentation, there are so many names, so many historical figures, so many stories, so many rabbit holes. But then there are names that I'd never heard of. Maybe no one had ever heard of. Somebody's heard of them, of course. There's names in there that aren't as prominent. And just like John B. Leet, his story, as far as I could tell until I looked into it, just had been lost, had been forgotten to time. The story of John Brown Leet was just not known to me, probably not known to many people, since he didn't have any direct descendants. I think the story of him, who he was to his family, died out with the people who knew him. So I was so happy to learn about him and bring his story to life and share that here, and to discover where he's buried and to get his find a grave information corrected, along with his brother George K. Leet Sr. So thanks for joining me with this episode, and I'll see you next time.